Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us for the e-launch and discussion of the State of Southeast Asia 2025 Survey Report. I am Indira Zahra Aridati of the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, and I will be your MC this morning. Before we begin, please allow me to draw your attention to a few housekeeping matters. For technical issues, please use the chat function to reach out to our technical support team. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function stating your name and your affiliation and direct your question to the relevant speaker. If there are media representatives in attendance who wish to attribute comments to one of our speakers, please seek the speaker's permission in advance. To begin the proceedings, I would like to invite Mr. Choi Shing Kwok, Head of the ASEAN Studies Centre, Director, and CEO of the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute to deliver his welcome remarks and to launch the survey. His welcome remarks will be followed by a presentation on the key findings of the survey report by Ms. Sharon Sia, Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Centre, and a discussion with our distinguished panelists with Mr. Choi Shing Kwok as moderator. Without further ado, I will pass the time to Mr. Choi. Mr. Choi, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning or good afternoon or even good evening for everyone who's tuning in to this webinar. I would like to wish you a very warm welcome, and I'll try to keep this short so we can give time for the substance of this launch. This is the annual events in which we launched the State of Southeast Asia Survey. So this is the 2025 edition. We've been doing this since 2019. And so this is actually something that we've been doing over the years. This is the 7th edition. And I think over the years, we've had a lot of interest and attention among policymakers, academia, and also the media from around the world who seek to understand elite opinions in a diverse and rapidly changing Southeast Asian region. This survey has proven to be a useful platform for Southeast Asian voices to be heard on important issues as well as challenges that the region is facing. And it also continues to be our Institute's most read and also most cited publication. This year's survey polled the views of just over 2,000 opinion leaders from across the 10 ASEAN countries. Plus, we also polled Timor-Leste for the first time, pending its formal admission to ASEAN. The survey was conducted over 6 weeks, from early January to mid-February this year. It is a period that straddles the inauguration of Donald Trump as US President for his second term. The findings of this survey provide insights into shared perspectives, aspirations, and also concerns of Southeast Asians, while also spotlighting the differences between the different national outlooks about regional events and priorities. Among the new questions explored in this edition are the rise in protectionism and nationalism, the emergence of new informal groupings, South China Sea concerns, and also the new Trump administration's engagement with Southeast Asia over the coming 4 years. Many of you will be curious to learn about the region's trust and distrust ratings towards the major powers as the region faces up to new global uncertainties. Popular questions such as how to move the Myanmar issue forward, the regional influence and leadership credentials of major powers, views about the incumbent US administration, and the future of relations with China and the US remain pertinent. Going forward with the benefit of 7 years' worth of data, we will be able to conduct a time series analysis to observe the continuity of existing trends as well as the emergence of new ones, while country-level data will also be useful for more in-depth analysis in the future. Researchers at my institute will continue to do analytical deep dives into these data sets in the coming months. So with that, am very pleased and honored that we have a really stellar panel of thought leaders and experts from the region, as well as from the US and China, to share their first-cut reactions and interpretations of this year's survey findings. The panel includes Dr. Mike Green, Professor and Chief Executive Officer of the United States Studies Centre in Australia, Professor Liu Lin of the Institute of International Strategic Studies from the Party School of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, Mr. Peter Varghese, Chancellor of the University of Queensland, Australia, and Ms Yenny Wahid, Director of the Wahid Foundation in Indonesia. Their insights will be invaluable in helping us to understand what the results say about Southeast Asia's outlook on the region and also its place in the world. Before we invite the panelists to comment on the results, let me first ask Ms. Sharon Seah, Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Centre, to present the first set of key findings in the State of Southeast Asia Survey Report, and she will present the second set later on. Over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Mr. Choi. A very good morning, afternoon, and evening to our audience. Welcome to the launch of the State of Southeast Asia 2025 Survey Report. I hope you can see the slides on the screen. There we go. So very quickly, it's in its 7th year, and this year we polled 2,023 Southeast Asian respondents. As Mr. Choi mentioned, it's notably for the first year we have perspectives from Timor-Leste. In terms of methodology, we have applied the same, and we also further asked new questions on the top news source, gender and political leanings. The survey comprised of 44 questions, and it was conducted fully online between 3rd January to 15 February this year. And also, as mentioned, the period of the data collection straddled the inauguration of the 47th President of the United States. About half of the respondents took the survey before 20th January, Inauguration Day, another half afterwards. We recorded no discernible difference in responses. And finally, we continue to apply the same 10% equal weightage because ASEAN decision-making processes is based on equal weightage. However, Timor responses are not weighted in the regional average because it is still pending admission to ASEAN. So for Timor-Leste responses, you will see it's reported separately, and you will find it interesting to see where Timor diverges or converges with ASEAN. So in terms of nationality, it's the same. However, this year, Indonesia overtook Singapore as the country with the highest number of respondents, followed by Singapore and Malaysia. Last year, Singapore led with the highest numbers. In terms of education, those with post-secondary and non-tertiary qualification respondents were the smallest group. So the highest group was the 53% with bachelor's degrees. In terms of affiliation, we have more or less maintained the same. The largest affiliation group comes from the private sector representatives. There was a slight increase in academia, think tanks, and research institutions, as well as government representatives. In terms of age, there were minimal changes in the age distribution. And then we asked this as a new open-ended question. And you will see in the word bubble that the most cited sources are newspapers, print media, and television. And the bigger the words, it means that more respondents cited those. So New York Times, Channel News Asia, and Straits Times, as you can see, is very visible. The respondents also highlight various local news sources, including those in their local language. Social media and messaging apps are also cited as another source of information, but to a lesser degree. In terms of gender, we have over 60% identifying as male and about 40% identifying as female. We also asked a question about political leanings. So over 90% of respondents believe that a democratic free political system that's characterized by free and fair elections, independent media, freedom of association, and speech to be the best form of governance, while 9.2% disagree. So the highest percentage that disagree comes from Brunei, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Moving on to the substance of the survey. This is a question that we ask every year, the top 3 challenges facing Southeast Asia. For the first time since we conducted this survey in 2019, climate change and more extreme weather events is now the region's biggest challenge at 55.3%, and it's overtaken last year's top concern, which is unemployment and economic recession. At the country level, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand are particularly concerned about climate change. Unemployment is followed by intensifying economic tensions at 3rd place, which was also last year's 3rd place. And this is a top challenge for Indonesia, whereas economic rivalry between the US and China is most keenly felt by Singapore, followed by Laos and Cambodia. We asked a question last year, which are the top 3 geopolitical concerns, and here 8 options were given. This year, the aggressive behaviour in South China Sea at 51.6% has overtaken Israel-Hamas conflict, which was the top concern last year. And this is followed by global scam operations at 48.1%. And worries about the new US leadership took 3rd place at 46.9%. So for the first concern on aggressive behaviour, actually the claimant states such as Philippines and Vietnam and Brunei rank it as their top concern. While one of the non-claimant states, Cambodia, also voted it as a top concern. Global scam operations is a more salient concern this year. It came in at 2nd place and it ranks highest, not surprisingly, for Thailand and Laos. For the worries about new US leadership, it's the top preoccupation for Singapore. So the other concerns ranked accordingly are in 4th place, Israel's war against Hamas and Hezbollah, international drug smuggling, followed by the Russia-Ukraine war, the ongoing crisis, and North Korea's ballistic missile test ranked last. In this question, we ask about top concern, but in a deviation, in order to pinpoint the region's top concerns, we only allow respondents to choose one option this year. In the past, they were allowed to choose 3 options. So as a result, we don't have a comparison with last year. But it's more or less the same. ASEAN is still seen as slow and ineffective by 35%. ASEAN becoming an arena of major power competition, another 1/3 of respondents feel that is their top concern. And ASEAN becoming increasingly disunited is felt by about 13.3%. So in the top concern about slow and ineffective ASEAN, I think that's voted top by Indonesia, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Brunei, and Thailand. In terms of ASEAN becoming an arena of power competition, this is a top tier for 4 members, Vietnam, Singapore, Philippines, and Malaysia. Moving on. In this question, which is a new question, how should ASEAN enhance its resilience and prove its own relevance? About 1/3 believe that ASEAN should resolve its own differences over issues such as Myanmar and the South China Sea. And for respondents coming from Vietnam, Myanmar, Philippines, Cambodia, and Indonesia, this is their top choice. Another 1/3 prefer that ASEAN focus on increasing intra-regional trade and investment. This is the top choice for Laos, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, and Brunei. Building alternative supply chains is particularly important for Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam. And cooperation with like-minded partners is actually the highest for Indonesia. So for about 2.5%, a very small number, think that ASEAN should do nothing because it is already resilient. For Timor-Leste's figures, resolving differences is also its top choice, so it's more or less aligned with the general view. Here in this question, which we asked for the first time last year, which members have made biggest contribution to ASEAN's long-term development and progress, Singapore and Indonesia remain the biggest contributors. And Singapore is the top choice for 6 ASEAN member states except for Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Of course, Malaysia is its own choice, and Malaysia is the second choice for Brunei and Laos. For Timor-Leste, its choices are equally split between Singapore and Indonesia. Okay, this is a question that we had back in 2021, and we brought it back this year on what is your top concern over the South China Sea situation. So 48.1% 33.2% say that China's encroachments in exclusive economic zones and the continental shelves of littoral states is their top concern. And this is most pronounced for Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Myanmar. This concern reflects a change from 2021 when we asked that question. In 2021, it was the second top concern, and in fact, China's militarization and assertive actions were considered the top concern back then in 2021. The second ranked concern at 44.3% is accidental confrontation between an ASEAN member state and China that may result in a political crisis. So for the non-littoral states, an accidental conflict between an AMS and China, and together with a direct confrontation between China and the US is their top concern, and that's Singapore, Laos, and Cambodia are most concerned about this. Then the third highest concern, which was the top concern in 2021, is China's increasing militarization and assertive actions at 40.6%. When asked how should ASEAN respond to the South China Sea situation, ASEAN is very consistent. It says that 69.5% says that it should take a principled stand that upholds international law, including the 1982 UNCLOS, and respect the 2016 tribunal ruling. Okay, this remains unchanged from 2021 when we asked this question. The second top option is to support actions that would bring deterrence against aggressive behavior at 46.1%, and then the third option is encouraging claimant states to resolve tensions through bilateral negotiations. So the least favored options are discouraging non-claimants from getting involved, and a fatalistic view that ASEAN cannot do anything because of the lack of solidarity, and then welcoming other military powers in the South China Sea. Following on in the South China Sea questions is views about the Code of Conduct, which, as you know, is being negotiated for the last few years. So 9 out of 10 ASEAN member states, with the exception of Brunei, say that the COC must be aligned with international law at 41%. Another 18.3% believe that the COC would prevent other powers from conducting military activities and energy exploration in the disputed areas. And the third view, which is a middle-of-the-road view, is that the COC will not resolve territorial disputes, but help with reducing tensions at 14.4%. So the view that the COC would prevent, the second view, other powers from conducting military activities is actually Brunei's top view, whereas 7 other ASEAN member states, including Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, rank it as their second view. Moving on the most likely impact of Israel's conflict with Hamas and Hezbollah on Southeast Asia, unlike last year where the region voted the rise in extremist activities to be their top concern, this year, in fact, diminished trust in international law and rules-based order has become its top concern. And this concern is more salient in Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, and Myanmar. In second place this year is the worry that there will be a catalytic rise in extremist activities impacting domestic and regional security at 27.1%. This view is highly shared by respondents from the Philippines, Singapore, Cambodia, and Thailand. And then at third place is the erosion of domestic social cohesion due to religious divisions at 17.6%. For Timor-Leste, they deviate in that they are worried about the rise in extremist activities over diminished trust in international law and rules-based order. When asked about views on the international community's response to Israel's conflict with Hamas and Hezbollah, the largest proportion at over 36% say they support a ceasefire and prioritize provision of humanitarian aid. This is a prevalent choice across all countries except for Indonesia, whose primary viewpoint is in favor of international backing for self-determination of the Palestinian people. Second most popular stance is to support a two-state solution as the only solution for Israel and Palestine at 21.4%. This view now is particularly strong in Singapore. And then the third choice is to support the right to self-determination for Palestinian people, with the highest numbers, not surprisingly, coming from Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. For Timor-Leste, respondents actually voted overwhelmingly selecting fostering dialogue, which is the fourth option on this chart, as their top choice. How should ASEAN respond to rising protectionism and nationalism around the world is a new question this year. So over 40% say that ASEAN must accelerate regional integration amongst itself, and Vietnam is most supportive of this option. The second ranked view is for ASEAN to deepen cooperation with like-minded partners at 30.9%, and Singapore views this as its best option. Strengthening ASEAN institutions that support rule of law is the third ranked by about a quarter of the respondents. Philippines in this respect is most supportive at 41.7%. And then the last two options of disengaging with established global trade systems and doing nothing, in general, they are more or less viewed as non-options because they only garnered about 1.2 and 3.7% respectively. Timor-Leste voted the same as the rest of the ASEAN 10. Moving on to regional influence. This is a question that is evergreen. We ask this question every year on which country or regional organization is most influential, and here China remains the most influential economic power at 56.4%, albeit with a slight decline from 59.5% last year. The US this year has overtaken ASEAN at second place. Its influence actually increased slightly from 14.3% last year to 15.4%. And ASEAN is the third most influential economic power, but it has declined from last year's 16.8% to 14.8%, so a decline of about 2%. In general, we also saw an increase of economic influence for other middle powers, including Australia, India, Japan, ROK, and the UK. The EU, though, saw a slight decline of 0.2%. When we ask what is their view, whether they are worried about the growing regional economic influence of this power or they welcome it, in general, the region continues to be worried about China's regional economic influence, albeit with a slight decline. The highest levels of concern were recorded from Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. About 57% welcome the US's economic influence, and this is higher than the 52% recorded last year. Majority of the respondents welcome ASEAN's growing regional economic influence at 68.5%, which is a significant increase from last year. And in this respect, Brunei, Laos, and Indonesia are most positive about ASEAN's influence. In the second part of this set of questions, which country has the most political and strategic influence in Southeast Asia? Here, China maintains its top spot, followed by the US and ASEAN. So China at 37.9%, followed by the US, 31.2%, and ASEAN at 15.6%. So of these three, only the US experienced an increase in its political and strategic influence. All of the middle powers have also seen slight improvements in their perceived influence, so signaling more or less the growing engagement of middle powers in the region's geopolitical landscape. On this view of whether they are worried or they welcome this political strategic power's influence on their country, so despite China's strong influence politically and strategically, the region remains worried at nearly 70% about its growing influence, although there was a decrease from 73.5% last year. Respondents seem to be more welcoming about the US's political strategic influence, and this reverses the trend last year. And on the other hand, the region continues to welcome ASEAN's increasing influence. In this question, which was introduced first time last year, we analyzed it using a different statistical method. It was we used a rank sum method, followed by a 10% weightage applied to each country to ensure proportionality. So here it's the same, the top three is the same. It's China, followed by US and Japan. And China is the top choice for 6 countries: Brunei, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand. Whereas the US is ranked first for Cambodia, Myanmar, the Philippines, and Vietnam. For Japan, it received the strongest support from Brunei and the Philippines. And then subsequently, you see that it's followed by the EU at 4th place, Australia, India, ROK, UK, Russia, Canada, and New Zealand. So this is a question about ranking the dialogue partners' strategic relevance for ASEAN. Another question on championing global free trade. And here we see that ASEAN has maintained its top spot, albeit with a decrease. And the strongest champions for ASEAN remains Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. When it comes to US and China, though, they have traded positions, with China overtaking the US for second position. And China is preferred by respondents from Brunei, Laos, and Thailand. In terms of providing leadership to maintain a rules-based order and upholding international law, the US maintains its top position from last year with a slight decrease. ASEAN and EU are in second and third place respectively. And support for ASEAN's leadership is actually particularly pronounced in Indonesia and Malaysia. This is a new question we introduced about new informal groupings forming outside of the international UN framework. Here you see that there are two responses that prioritize ASEAN and are wary of these other groupings, and this is favored by half of the ASEAN 10 respondents. That's actually at top place 26.2% to strengthen ASEAN's convening power and normative influence, and at 23.8% that countries should be mindful of joining groupings that risk undermining ASEAN centrality. Yeah, so for the first one on strengthening ASEAN's convening power, this is a top choice for Indonesia, Philippines, Brunei, and Malaysia. For the second group, where ASEAN member states should be mindful of joining groupings that undermines ASEAN, this is top for Thailand and Singapore. And here you can see that actually everyone is keeping their options open. At 23.5%, they say they should join together. ASEAN joins together as a collective to pursue regional interests. And about 1/5, 20.2%, say countries are free to join any grouping that meets their national interests. And only 6.2% are staunchly saying that ASEAN countries don't join any groupings. Okay, I have ended this section.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I think in general, the results may have been, some of them may have been a little bit of a surprise, and some of them may have been as perhaps we may have expected. So we're going to zoom a little bit into a couple of issues to begin with that are showing up for the first time this year in a bigger way. The first one is really on the South China Sea. I think there were in total 3 questions that actually talked about the South China Sea. And the 3 questions were the one that listed aggressive behavior in the South China Sea as the top geopolitical concern of the respondents. And another question on the South China Sea said, basically had the result that half of the respondents were concerned over China's encroachment in the EEZs and the continental shelves of littoral states of Southeast Asia. And in a related result to the same question, there are also 44% that were worried about the risk of accidental conflict between an ASEAN state and China that becomes a political crisis. And finally, in a third question on this subject, more than 2/3, which is about close to 70% of the respondents believe that ASEAN should take a very principled stand that upholds international law in response to what is happening in the South China Sea. So given these concerns, how do you assess the response of the ASEAN states to these disputes so far? And if you have a view on what they should do differently or what more can they do, I would also really very much like the panelists to comment on that. So perhaps I can invite the panelists in perhaps the order I say, which is Dr. Mike Green first, then Professor Liu Lin, then Peter Varghese, and then Ms Yenny, Ibu Yenny, to come up towards the end. So over to you, Mike, first.
Thanks very much, Professor Choi. Thank you, Sharon, for that excellent briefing, and congratulations to the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies for another spectacular report. I have done this kind of survey work at CSIS at our center in Sydney. It's a lot of work, and the design has to be very well done, and this is always an impressive, important, and influential report. So congratulations. On the issue you raised, the South China Sea, you can see clearly there's increasing concern about aggressive behavior. Presumably that means aggressive behavior by China and not New Zealand or Canada. And now it's the top concern of the list of concerns. What I found interesting is that you noted earlier there's an increase in preference for aligning with the United States. Last year, Americans were surprised that China was the preferred partner for strategic alignment. I suspect that had a lot to do with the conflict in Gaza. This year, the U.S. is back as the preferred partner in the survey. I think some credit probably goes to the Biden administration, but I suspect a lot of it has to do with the answer to this question about the greatest security concern and the fact that aggressiveness in the South China Sea is the number one concern. So not surprising you'd have a correlation between that and an increase in the number of people who prefer the U.S. as a security partner, right? With these polls, you can see the correlation. You can't prove the causality, but I think the causality is likely that. The second thing that struck me is when you look at the specific country respondents, unsurprisingly, the Philippines and Vietnam are most concerned by a wide margin about the security problems in the South China Sea. Not surprising, given the confrontations between China and the Philippines. And I think that also helps to explain a bit of what's happening in terms of security partnerships. The Squad, as it's called, the US, Australia, Japan, and the Philippines are stepping up cooperation to support the Philippines. EDCA, the US-Philippines agreement, is being turbocharged. So you didn't have a question about this, but I think the variation, unsurprising differences in how ASEAN member states view aggression in the South China Sea would explain why the Philippines are aligning much more closely with the US and Japan and Australia, but especially the US, compared with other ASEAN states. So there's differentiated behavior in response to the threats that reflects the differentiated prioritization you have in your polls. So a lot of these elite polls you have to interpret and guess. You see correlation, you can't prove causality, but that would be my interpretation of what the South China Sea responses tell us about the views of the US, the behavior of the Philippines, and so forth.
Professor Liu.
Yes, thank you. Hello, Sharon. Hello, Director Ms. Chua. It's a great pleasure to be able to join the discussion of this year's, the launch of this year's survey report. Because this report, as we all know, is quite influential worldwide. As to the question on the South China Sea, I think that the South China Sea issue is a top concern for the ASEAN countries. Is not surprising, especially given the escalation of disputes between China and some of the claimants in the past 2 years. But I think a more holistic view is needed. Some of the perceptions of the South China Sea issue, I think, is one-sided or biased, such as the dispute between China and the Philippines over the Second Thomas Shoal. Because the root cause of this dispute is, in fact, the illegal grounding of the warship on the shoal in 1999. China has always been asking the Philippines to withdraw the ship, but the Philippines up to now has refused to do so. Out of the humanitarian considerations, China allowed the Philippines to, supply living materials to the personnel on the shoal, but no construction materials are allowed. However, in recent years, the Philippines, I think they violated the understanding between China and the Philippines and began to send some construction materials to the show. So that's why the escalation of this round of dispute. In fact, the legal issues on the South China Sea is quite complicated. So it is difficult for countries to reconcile their own positions on this issue. But I think from China's perspective, we think that the UNCLOS, of course, we should take UNCLOS as one of the basis for settling the dispute, but it is not the sole basis. We should have the other basis of international law, and historical evidence should also be considered. If the South China Sea issue is getting out of control, it will not only affect the China and the claimants directly, but also it will have vast regional and global repercussions, I think. So I think the most urgent thing is to control and manage the issue. I found it's very interesting that in this survey, although Malaysia is a claimant, but aggression in the South China Sea is not a top-ranked concern for Malaysia. This shows that different claimants, ASEAN claimants, they have different approach in settling this issue. So I think this provides some basis for China and the ASEAN claimants to cooperate on settling the disputes. For example, last year, maybe many people just noticed that we have some instance with the Philippines, but we also made some progress in enhancing the dialogue between China and Malaysia. We have established we had the first meeting of the bilateral dialogue on maritime issues. And Yenny might know that China and Indonesia, we also reached some understanding on enhancing maritime cooperation. In fact, China and the Indonesia Coast Guard had the first joint meeting. So I think that besides, I also find a very interesting result, that is for the COC negotiation, the second ranked view by ASEAN 10 is the hope that the COC would prevent other powers from conducting military activities and energy exploration with ASEAN countries. So this shows that ASEAN also want, the dispute can be resolved between ourselves and with less, external interference. That's my idea. Thank you.
Peter, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Choi and Sharon, and thank you for the opportunity to join this terrific panel. And congratulations on the survey, which I think continues to be a very important source of insight and analysis. If you step back a little bit from the entrails of the positions of different claimants in the South China Sea, I think the message we get from this survey, and it's not a new message, is that ASEAN frets about how to protect their interests in a world which may increasingly be dominated by the brutal reality of big powers and big power politics. So how do you bridge the very significant gap in power between individual ASEAN countries on the one hand and the big players? Now, inevitably, international law is one measure or one means of narrowing that gap, obviously not eliminating that gap. And so I think the the options open to ASEAN must include a very strong and robust and public defense of the underlying international law principles, not least because we are dealing here, as we are elsewhere in the multilateral system, with the reality that there is no enforcement mechanism for breaches of international law. But that doesn't mean that one can simply ignore the fact that this has been tested in the appropriate international tribunal, and a verdict was given, which the ASEAN countries ought to not only welcome, but I think use in their public positioning. Beyond that, it does seem to me that there is room for ASEAN to adopt a more collective position here, because again, if it's the underlying power imbalance, which is a key part of this, then collective action can help you in that. So rather than being picked off, as it were, one by one, a more common position, and I acknowledge that there are difficulties in arriving at that, would certainly be helpful, as would, in my view, exercises in freedom of navigation and so on, which can reinforce the underlying international legal principles. But I think it would be a mistake to sort of look at this issue as simply one of international law and, you know, who's within their legal rights and who's trespassing on legal rights. I mean, the South China Sea reflects a more fundamental issue, and the underlying strategic dynamics of the region feed into this. And ultimately, I think what we're looking at is really how do we find a new strategic equilibrium which can be stabilizing in the region and which can offer a measure of breathing space for not only ASEAN, but also for the other members of the Indo-Pacific. And that's a much bigger set of issues, a much bigger project. But the concerns about the South China Sea, in a sense, are reflective of that larger underlying strategic dynamic.
Thank you, Peter. Ibu Yenny, on your shoulders rest the views of Southeast Asian respondents.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Director. And good to see all of you again from ISEAS through online. And if not for ASEAN, I probably wouldn't wake up because this is still the 8th week in Indonesia. And as you know, the 8th week is very... It's a big thing, you know, for us. It's a time for family gatherings and such. But thank you very much for having me here, and congratulations also for the release of the survey. It's very interesting to read through that, and you know, especially some of the findings concerning ASEAN and China relations. So. I'm going to speak from not only from the Indonesia's perspective mostly, but also from the communities that I am engaged with, the Nahdlatul Ulama, you know, as the grassroots. So from that perspective, the South China Sea is not just a strategic matter. It is a lived experience for us. Our fishermen in Natuna, for example, feel the pressure of gray zone operations and encroachments. So this is not just an abstract debate when it comes to the issue. It is about sovereignty, about dignity and economic survival for our people. So ASEAN's response so far, I mean, we must acknowledge that ASEAN's response has been overly cautious. Of course, we have our commitment to peace and dialogue, and it is very commendable. But our reaction has always been more reactive rather than anticipatory. And but the shifting dynamics in the region actually requires us to be more strategic, more assertive, and more legally grounded. And President Prabowo recently moved in to bring in thinkers like Professor John Mearsheimer and Professor Yusof Ishak. Of course, Professor Mearsheimer is known for his theory of offensive realism, and Yusof Ishak is a champion of multilateralism and development. So this, for us in Indonesia, this reflects a deliberate attempt to balance power-centric strategic thinking with human-centric global outlook. And it probably signals that Indonesia is recalibrating. We are moving from our traditionally non-aligned position to a more nuanced, assertive, and interest-driven foreign policy. This recalibration will influence how we engage China, not through open confrontation, but through strategic firmness grounded in international law. Professor Liu mentioned earlier about Indonesia and China's recent move to strengthen maritime cooperation. We probably will be seeing more engagement like this, but our positions has always been quite firm on the issue of South China Sea. So in that context, in my opinion, ASEAN must do three things. The first one, that we must institutionalize the rule of law within our regional framework. We can no longer afford generic statements. We must reinforce UNCLOS, of course, support member states with legal standing, and push for a binding, verifiable code of conduct with clear enforcement mechanisms. We also must prepare for long-term regional deterrence, not escalation. We must invest in maritime capacity building. This is something that we are looking at now, focusing more on Coast Guard cooperation and also surveillance interoperability. Indonesia can lead these initiatives, we feel, in a way that strengthens ASEAN resilience without triggering direct confrontation with China. So we also must recognize that Asian unity must evolve. Unity does not mean waiting for unanimity. A coalition of commitment, a group of ASEAN states willing to act within the bounds of law and collective interest. This might be necessary to move forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Yenny. Thank you all respondents. I think the issue of the South China Sea obviously is something that we could spend the whole sort of panel discussion circling back onto it. But I think we heard the views of the panelists. One thing that seems to come through all is that the emphasis on international law seems very much to be something that is agreed to by all. There is I think, other factors that have to be taken into account, and I think that political factors, historical factors, I think that's also something that has been raised. And also as far as the response of ASEAN countries is concerned, it's very differentiated today, going towards a more unified policy obviously will strengthen, but then again, it is not something that's easily going to be done, and I think the suggestions are most welcome. We are going to move on in the interest of time to other issues that were raised. I want to raise the issue that was a new question this year because it kind of reflects the way the world has changed in the last year or so. And that's on the issue of rising protectionism and nationalism. So in this survey, 40% believe that the way to deal with this is to accelerate regional integration among member states, something that also came up in responses to the last round of panel discussion. There's also about a third that favor deepening cooperation with like-minded partners beyond ASEAN as a better strategy. So 40%, regional integration among the member states, 30%, one third, integrating with like-minded partners beyond ASEAN. So in your view, if I may ask all the panelists to chime in a minute or two each on this question, in your view, what should ASEAN's response be in navigating these challenges, which is rising protectionism and nationalism? Do you agree that the two chosen top responses are actually good ones, and if not, then what else? So I think we'll go in the same order for this round, and over to you, Mike. Yeah.
Well, I'm talking to you from Washington, D.C., and happy Liberation Day, as President Trump calls it. He announced today the largest increase in U.S. tariffs since the 1930s. Not good, but important to appreciate that the fragmentation in the global economic order did not begin with Donald Trump. There were a lot of factors that really drove this before his Liberation Day. China in 2024 had a record $1 trillion surplus with the world. And it's not just the US, but EU, Japan, Korea, other advanced manufacturing economies that are looking at protectionism and tariffs. So we're clearly in a new world where the old sort of trade liberalization, Bretton Woods rules are hard. And that's a disadvantage for smaller economies. Clearly, it's a disadvantage. So what should ASEAN do? I think the respondents are right. You fight protectionism with trade liberalization. ASEAN-wide trade liberalization deals with Europe, with Japan, with Australia, with India if possible. Ultimately, the U.S. Position is going to be shaped by the politics and the economics, and 2/3 of Americans oppose tariffs. This is not popular. The Dow futures dropped 980 points. So the internal dynamics on tariffs in terms of political and economic consequences for President Trump are negative. And in the theory of trade liberalization, if ASEAN is increasing the trade liberalization, that gives more agency to ASEAN, more leverage, and I think it will have an impact on the U.S. debate as well. So I think the respondents are right. But it's not easy, because when protectionism is in the air, it takes real political leadership to push for trade liberalization. So right answer, not easy to do.
Prof Liu.
Thank you. I think that in facing of rising protectionism and nationalism, ASEAN has always been willing to enhance its own unity and integration. So I also think that the ASEAN, the survey result shows ASEAN's right choice for in dealing with the protectionism. In fact, I think that this will enhance ASEAN's strategic autonomy and enhance its relevance and centrality. ASEAN has always been, doing this. ASEAN is nearing to finish the ASEAN Community Vision 2025 and is soon to launch the ASEAN Community Vision 2045. So both of these efforts are showing ASEAN is trying to enhance its own integration so as to enhance its relevance and flexibility in adapting to these volatile geopolitical situations. But I also think that while strengthening its own integration process, ASEAN still need to cooperate with the outside partners, just as the second ranked view that has shown that ASEAN also want to cooperate with like-minded partners, because I think this is defined by the ASEAN's the concept of openness and inclusiveness that ASEAN has always advocated. And also it is influenced by the global economic and supply chain situation. Besides, the global governance also needs the participation of all countries. And ASEAN, the intra-regional trade is still not a majority compared with extra-regional trade in this area. So I think ASEAN need to combine the further integration with the cooperation with the outside partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. So look, I think we're at a crossroads at the moment when it comes to the entire international economic system. I think it's been fraying for quite a while, but it seems, not least on this Liberation Day, that the Trump administration wants to deliver at the coup de grace. Now, Southeast Asia and other countries, including Australia, have been enormous beneficiaries of a global economy that was continuing to open up. And we're not going to go back to the good old days anytime soon. So I think the best strategy is effectively all of the above. In other words, to look for every opportunity available to try and not only save as much of the furniture of multilateral machinery as possible, but to focus even more intently on economic growth and economic heft in a very different environment. So for ASEAN, I think that means continuing and indeed quickening the pace of ASEAN trade and investment liberalization, because I think it's clear that that works. I mean, the whole problem we're facing at the moment is that open economies have worked economically, but they haven't worked politically. And until we get those two into realignment, we're going to find ourselves in the position that we currently have. I think it's also the case that we should be looking at how regional instruments and agreements can be adapted to a different international system, whether we should be turbocharging arrangements such as the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, whether we should be looking at sub-regional arrangements, because in the absence of a global trading and investment regime, inevitably, I think we're going to fall back on more regional arrangements. And even those regional arrangements are going to be very difficult to put together. And so sub-regional arrangements, I think, are going to also be part of a menu of responses. And at the political level, I think we're all going to have to learn how to re-articulate the case for an open economy, because the case that has been made over the last several decades, notwithstanding its on-the-ground success, simply has no political traction, or very little political traction in many countries. So I think we're going to have to work every available lever we have here, given that the big frameworks which have delivered the big outcomes are now in disarray.
Ibu Yenny, are you with us? Can I ask your comments on this question? I think she may be having some technical difficulties. So perhaps let me move on until she can get back to join us. I think for this particular question, it seems like at least the three speakers that have spoken, the panel has agreed that ASEAN has got kind of the right priorities of how to respond to the current situation, which is further internal integration and also linking up with other partners that they can. And indeed, if that is the case, then there will be responses that will come over time quite quickly. In the interest of time, I think we're going to come to the US-China influence issues. I'm going to roll that together with the second segment so that we can tackle that issue, the US-China. I think Mike had earlier also already raised some of the findings that are coming out of that section. So I think we will have Sharon now present the second bit of the presentation, a lot of which is focused on the US and China, and also a little bit on the other major powers. And then we will tackle all that in the second round with the panelists, so that we can discuss this issue holistically after this. So let me bring Sharon back on for the second half of the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Choi. Can we bring the slides back up? Okay, here we go. So I think this is the section that we have a lot of spotlight on, and I'm just going to move to the question that everyone's very curious to know. If ASEAN were forced to align itself with one of the two strategic rivals, which should it choose? So the US this year overtakes China as the preferred strategic power at 52.3%, and China at 47.7%. So if you see the infographic, there's been a reversal. In 2024, China overtook the US. Now, the greatest support for China comes from Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Brunei, and Laos. And the greatest support for the US comes from the Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Singapore. So you see that it's still the same 50-50 split in the ASEAN countries. And for Timor-Leste respondents, they have expressed a preference for the US, with a majority of 59.1% from Timor supporting the US. And the next one, where we ask if ASEAN were to seek out third parties to hedge against uncertainties, who would be your preferred and trusted strategic partner? The EU and Japan, not surprisingly, remain ASEAN's top two choices. And support for the EU ranks at 36.3%, coming strongest from Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and Myanmar. And for Japan, at 29.6%, the strongest support is from Philippines, Malaysia, and Singapore. Interestingly, also, we have noted that India continues to be a growing preference, with a slight increase from 10.5% to 13.5% this year. Australia, ROK, and the UK unfortunately experienced a decline this year. For Timor-Leste, they recognize the EU as their top partner, followed by Australia. So Australia ranks highest in Timor-Leste, actually. In the next few questions, we are going to examine China's relations with bilateral relations with the countries in the region in the next 3 years. And here, about half expect either an improvement or significant improvement in their relationship with China, higher than those who are expecting a status quo. And respondents who expect bilateral relations to worsen or worsen significantly increase only very slightly, from 18.1% to 19.5% in 2025. A large majority of Timor-Leste express strong optimism for improved relations. When we ask what could potentially worsen your positive impression of China, and here you see that China's strong arm tactics in the South China Sea and the Mekong is cited as the region's top concern at 28.8%. This is highest for respondents coming from claimant states Vietnam, Philippines, and Brunei. China's interference in domestic affairs is the second most cited concern at 28.2%, and particularly prevalent in Singapore, Indonesia, and Cambodia. At third place is the use of economic tools and tourism to punish bilateral relations, punish another country's foreign policy choices. Yes. And Timor-Leste respondents here are more concerned about this aspect than others. On what China can do to improve relations with their countries, here in this, similar to last year, and here you see that there's, last year we allowed the choose two response, this year it's choose one. So, but it's still the same, 33% say that China should resolve all territorial and maritime disputes peacefully in accordance with international law. And then followed by 28.1% 40.1% who say that China should respect their country's sovereignty and not constrain their country's foreign policy choices in the second position, same as last year. And only a very small minority think that the fault lines can never be bridged. So in third place and fourth place is about 18.2% and 17.9% respectively, saying that we should make bilateral trade truly beneficial. And at fourth place, deepening understanding between in people-to-people relations. We included this new set of questions this year about countries' relations with the United States evolving in the next 4 years, because we had sensed that there has been a shift geopolitically across the world. Here, 46% are optimistic that relations with the US over the next 4 years will improve significantly. And this optimism is highest in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. About 40% expect relations to remain status quo. And another 14.2% say that relations will deteriorate. This is highest for Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. When we ask what could potentially worsen their positive impression of the United States, here the top concern is that the US will interfere with the country's domestic affairs at 29.2%, followed by the US's support for Israel at 27.2%. So on interference, this is highest in Singapore, Philippines, Vietnam, and Cambodia, whereas over discontent over US's support for Israel, this comes strongest from Indonesia and Malaysia. And then the third-ranked option is actually the US's use of sanctions to punish other countries, and followed by a smaller percentage at 17% that the frequent patrols and exercises in the South China Sea could worsen. And here it relates back to those concerns on security. Support for Taiwan ranks the lowest at 5.2%. On what the US can do to improve relations with their countries, again, ASEAN's very consistent. It is to ask the US to respect international law and its institutions at nearly 40%, followed by respecting their country's sovereignty at 24.4%. At third rank, to make trade truly beneficial for both sides. And then at fourth rank, to deepen understanding between its people. And then finally, a very small percentage say that the fault lines can never be breached. So for the first one, on respecting international law and not undermining the global system, this is most prevalent for Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam, whereas Cambodia, Philippines, and Indonesia remain more wary of the US's policies that are perceived as meddling in their domestic affairs. Now, this is a question that we have asked every year under different administrations. So in their views of the Trump 2.0 administration, 40.7% actually feel that the US's engagement under President Trump will either increase or increase significantly this year. And another third, 31.8%, say that US engagement will either decrease or decrease significantly. So the middle grounders at 27.6% say that it will remain unchanged. Those who are most optimistic about increased US engagement with Southeast Asia under President Trump are Laos, Vietnam, Brunei, and Cambodia, whereas Singapore is most pessimistic about US's engagement in the region, followed by Malaysia and Thailand. For Timor, they are equally split between optimism and pessimism. When asked why they think that the level of US engagement will increase, here in the orange bubble, 38.7% attribute to President Trump's tough stance on China to help maintain a balance of power. And this is mostly coming from Laos, Singapore, and Myanmar. Another 31.7% say that President Trump's leadership could resolve conflicts around the world, which was a presidential campaign promise. This is most strongly felt in Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And then another 29.6% say that President Trump may work with some ASEAN countries against China, mostly coming from Indonesia and Singapore. And when we ask why they think that the level of engagement will decrease, here the majority, 51.2%, point to President Trump's volatility his unpredictability in approaching foreign policy choices, mostly shared by Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. 32.3%, the second biggest group, feel that the Trump administration lacks strategic interest in Southeast Asia. This is most strongly felt in Cambodia, Philippines, and Singapore. And only about 16.5% think that President Trump will completely ignore the region and work directly with China. And this view is shared mostly by Laos, Brunei, Myanmar, and Vietnam. When we ask how confident they are of the US as a strategic partner and provider of regional security, here the biggest proportion at nearly 45% say that view the US positively as a security partner. Interestingly, this is an increase of 10 percentage points compared to last year. And another 31.3% express no confidence or little confidence in the US. This is a decrease, interestingly, from 40.1% in 2024. And those that are neutral also decreased from 25 to 23.7%. So the distrust towards the US as a strategic partner is most pronounced in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, whereas Laos, Philippines, and Vietnam stand out for their confidence in the US as a security partner. My last slide here is on the trust and distrust rankings of major powers in the region. And here we poll on 5 countries, US, China, Japan, EU, and India. Very interesting, this year all powers had an increase in trust levels, and everyone had a decrease in distrust. And here you will see that Japan leads the pack at 66.8%, an increase from 58.9%. So it's a wide margin over second place, which is the EU, at 51.9%. And this year, compared to last year, the EU overtook the US as the second most trusted power, leaving the US in third place at 47.2% for trust. China has also increased in its trust levels from 24.8% last year to 36.6%, and India too, interestingly, has increased from 24.2% to 35.3%. The reasons for trust varies. So the top-sided reason for Japan is the fact that Japan is a responsible stakeholder for maintaining international law. And for the EU, again, the respondents attribute it to the EU's stance on environment, human rights, and climate change as being very positive for them. In terms of distrust, just to point out that China's distrust ratings saw a sizable decrease from 50.1% last year to 41.2%. So for the respondents who distrust China, they think that China's economic and military power can be used to threaten their interests and sovereignty. Similarly, for distrust towards India, it has also seen a decrease. I think I'll stop here and let Mr. Choi take over.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And let me now bring on the hot topic of the US and China influence in the region, and also the preferences by the regional respondents towards US and China. So I think just to point out from the last section of the presentation by Sharon, China actually remains the most influential economic and strategic political power in the region. It is ahead of the US in both these dimensions, but the US has actually strengthened its position in both these aspects, as well as economic power and also a political strategic power in the region. So the gap between the China and the US has actually narrowed on these series of questions. But let me marry that together with the question on the preferred choice between US and China. We have seen the US actually outpace China to become the preferred choice this year. It's at 52.3% if the region were forced to choose. And this is a reversal of positions. Last year, China was marginally ahead as the preferred choice. So can I ask each of the panelists to comment on these developments, and in particular, given these evolving dynamics, what do you think ASEAN's stance should be, and how can the group best navigate this intensifying competition between the two powers? Do you think that another possible development, which I think has also been kind of partially indicated in one of the questions, answers to one of the questions, that the second Trump administration may prefer to just work bilaterally and therefore take ASEAN as a regional grouping to the sidelines rather than to deal with it as a collective group. So perhaps I can, because China is the biggest influence, perhaps I can ask Prof Liu to go first, and then Mike can follow after, because the US is the outpaced China on the stakes on preferred choice. Yeah, so Prof Liu, and then the rest can come in after.
Thank you, Mr. Choi. I'm very glad to see that China still maintains the dominant economic and political strategic geopolitical influence in ASEAN. But I think that the main factor driving the ASEAN's choice of China as the most economically influential country in this region is that really the economy is the driving force for China-ASEAN relationship. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the establishment of dialogue and relations between China and ASEAN. Over the past 30 years, China and ASEAN have the trade between China and ASEAN has skyrocketed by more than 80 times. And last year, China has been the ASEAN's largest trade partner for 16 consecutive years, while ASEAN has also been China's largest trading partner since 2020. I think the logic between China and ASEAN trade or economic relationship is not driven by the outside factors, but it is out of our own mutual interests and our own intrinsic to develop the closer economic relationship. So this kind of relationship is can be durable and can be very stable. And also China and ASEAN, our economic relationship is continually evolving by adapting to the internal and external circumstances. So that's why these bilateral relations can keep its momentum through such a long period. In fact, in recent years, China and ASEAN is also adjusting by exploring cooperation in emerging fields such as green economy, blue economy, and EV and things like that, digital economy. So I think I'm quite agree with the ASEAN respondents to this survey that we can be optimistic about the development of China and ASEAN economic relationship. As to the geopolitical influence, I think it's as two big powers of the world, the US and China has been ranked as the top two in terms of geopolitical influence. It's quite natural. But this survey also shows that the ASEAN respondents also have some concerns about these influences, both to China and the United States. I think for China, we think that the trust is still the main obstacle for China and ASEAN, relationship. So I think we should properly handle the differences, try to control the differences and disputes, and also enhancing practical cooperation in the South China Sea. And also because of the potential impacts of the U.S. policy in Asia on East Asian and broader Asia-Pacific cooperation, China and ASEAN can champion multilateralism, open regionalism, ASEAN centrality, and inclusive regional order. We should defend the fundamental architecture of regional cooperation, which is centered with ASEAN at the center. And also considering how U.S. policies may impede economic globalization while reinforcing regionalism, China and ASEAN can advance global cross-regional cooperation by expanding horizontal connections, such as promoting China-ASEAN Gulf Cooperation Council, China-ASEAN South Asia cooperation frameworks, so as to create more expansive and robust global cross-regional cooperative networks. Thank you.
Mike, go ahead.
This section was really fascinating. If you just step back and look at these numbers, remember this is an elite poll. And so when you do samples with the general public, you can control for gender and for age and for socioeconomic things. But when you do elite polling, you don't have those same controls, as you know from doing the survey. So it's not as precise because you may have a selection bias in who you consider elite, for example. So that means if there is no real measurable margin of error statistically, and when you think of it that way, even though China's up in terms of influence and the U.S. is up in terms of preferred partner, they're actually quite close, the U.S. and China. And this in some ways could be considered a success for ASEAN's diplomacy. No single great power is dominating Southeast Asia. The questions about Japan and Australia and India and the EU show that not only is there no single power dominating, but ASEAN states have multiple partners to work with to maintain a balance of power and influence. So just stepping back, I think there's some good news in this for ASEAN. Second, I was really struck that the U.S. Confidence in the U.S. as a partner went up significantly. I think it was 8 or 10 points, significantly after Donald Trump got elected, right? These questions were asked in January. So a lot of experts around the world have predicted that a Trump presidency would mean abandonment of Asia or retreat from Southeast Asia. That's not how your respondents anticipate a Trump administration. The numbers who thought the U.S. would be a reliable partner went up, which I found quite interesting. I think a lot of people in the U.S. would find that surprising. Not Trump supporters, but Trump's critics would find that surprising. And the questions about President Trump are quite complex. You have very strong views that he's going to engage more. You have strong views that he's not going to engage more. My takeaway from that is we should be very careful not to stereotype or simplify how ASEAN states will respond to Donald Trump or how a Trump administration will necessarily work with ASEAN. Secretary of Defense Hegseth was just in the region, increasing defense spending, increasing defense engagement, a continuity from Biden. But I think those who thought that the Trump administration would increase engagement are right, but it's largely going to be in defense and national security. Those who worry the Trump administration will retreat are probably right when it comes to trade agreements and some of those other issues. It's complicated, I think, is the takeaway. I think that's reflected in the answers. I was also struck, your survey did the homework for the State Department and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing. It clearly said if you want to improve relations with ASEAN, Beijing, then you need to peacefully resolve these conflicts in the South China Sea. And it said to Washington, if you want to improve relations, you need to respect international law and institutions. So the message is clear, and my prediction is that in 2025, China will not peacefully resolve the South China Sea, and I'm not confident the Trump administration will reassure ASEAN on institutions. So both Beijing and Washington know what they need to do to improve relations. I'm not sure either will pick it up, and I suspect in a year we'll find that the results are similarly divided. The last thing I'd say is you asked about 16%, I suspect mostly in Singapore, worry about a US-China condominium. And there's no doubt President Trump is intrigued by grand summits with Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un, or potentially in June with Xi Jinping. But I am personally very doubtful that there will be a US-China condominium. I don't think Beijing trusts the Trump administration. I don't think the Trump administration trusts Beijing. I don't think it's very likely, to be honest. The last thing I would say is, I'm just going to say this to trigger Peter Varghese, but the measurement of Australia's influence is quite interesting. Now, it's only a 1-point decrease from about 9% to 8%, but it's not an increase. And the Albanese government has really put an emphasis on strengthening Australian agency in ASEAN and on making Australia a preferred partner for ASEAN. And I don't know what explains the fact that those numbers didn't go up, but the Southeast Asia branch of DFAT has grown enormously in size. The Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, has put enormous effort into ASEAN, I think rightly so, and it would appear effectively. So it does strike me that the numbers didn't go up for Australia. Maybe that's about packaging and branding and presentation and not substance, but that one jumped out at me as well. I just don't want America and China to be the only ones in the hot seat, Peter. So over to you.
Yeah, Peter, I think you have the right to the floor and reply to that right now.
I will come back to Mike's point, but the first thing I want to say is that if this survey were to be taken today, I'm not sure it would replicate the answers that we got, which is really just a reflection of how things have moved and how rapidly they've moved just in the last month or so, and the perception that Trump 2.0 is a very different administration to what we saw in Trump 1.0. But whether or not that's the case, I mean, I think nothing in the survey, to my mind, changed the reality that ASEAN countries and ASEAN as an entity simply does not want to choose between China and the US. And yes, if you pose the question, if you're forced to choose, who do you go for? You get the numbers that we've seen, and those numbers over time may sort of change here and there. But it doesn't, I think, mask the reality that the larger interest of ASEAN is more in a stable balance than in aligning themselves with one or the other of the Indo-Pacific superpowers. I think at the moment there is a real question mark about what the Trump administration's approach to the Indo-Pacific is going to be. And even if you accept Mike's judgment that the idea of a G2 is unlikely, I mean, the reality is the spectrum of outcomes at the moment is pretty wide, ranging from a G2 arrangement all the way through to a much harder-edged strategic competition between the US and China. And it's not clear to me whether the Trump administration is in the tradition of virtually all of its predecessors since the Second World War, in framing US strategic policy around the core objective of the maintenance of strategic primacy, and particularly strategic primacy in Eurasia. Does the Trump administration have a different view, and does it think about US exceptionalism and US primacy in a much more economic frame than it does in a strategic military frame? I think these are all still rather open questions, and while they remain open, I think the countries in the region are just going to be cautious about making judgments of what the future trajectory is going to be. I think it's also the case that the behavior of the Trump administration since the inauguration has, in a sense, taken some of the heat off China when it comes to ASEAN perceptions of the two of them. So to the extent that what we're seeing in these surveys, and it's not just this one, is a level of anxiety about China's throwing its weight around or its ability to use economic leverage as a means of coercion, or its wolf warrior diplomacy, which I think has now shifted significantly. Those attributes, if you like, are now being ascribed to the Trump administration, and in a way, the Trump administration is out wolf worrying what China had been doing. So it, to that extent, I think provides China with opportunities and an opening, which will then maybe lead to some shifts in the way in which each of them are perceived in the region by ASEAN countries. On Mike's point about Australia, I mean, I think the margin there is not significant, going down 1%, or indeed if we had gone up 1%. What strikes me about the survey's results in this area is just what a huge gap there is between the US and China on the one hand, and then everybody else when it comes to questions of influence, whether that's Japan or the EU or Australia or Korea. So this is still very much a part of the world where it's the two big players that are shaping all of the key perceptions. Now, to what extent that's going to shift over time, let's have a look. I mean, I think we're in this rather odd position at the moment, a rather peculiar position, where more and more countries are looking at both a China +1 strategy and a US +1 strategy. So we've had some years of contemplating a China +1 strategy, but now we're beginning to see the emergence of the US +1 as an objective that many countries are heading towards. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yenny, I think you're up.
Thank you. I would like to echo what Peter mentioned earlier, that if the survey had been taken on different times, that the result might be quite different. I mean, there are two factors that recent dynamics that have not been taken into account. First is, of course, the Trump's newly announced tariffs, even though we are quite aware of that because he spoke about it, but still the real impact will be felt in the next coming months. And also the what Professor Green said about the Defense Secretary's visit to Philippines, that reiterates the US willingness to reestablish deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region. These are two factors that could probably sway the results if it had been taken in different times in different ways. So so the result could be the current result might be quite transient in a way. But for the sake of just looking at the numbers that's been shown through the surveys, I think I would say that the rise of the in U.S. influences across ASEAN, overtaken China, is less about renewed economic integration and more of a reflection of the strategic anxiety felt by the region. There is a growing concern over the region across Southeast Asia, over China's assertiveness, especially, of course, in the South China Sea, and the artificial islands, the militarized artificial islands, and how we feel about the harassment of our coast guards, for example. These have escalated the tensions from bilateral tensions to regional insecurity. So ASEAN probably feels that the US is the only actor that is willing to push back, that has the military capability and political willingness to push back. So it is that fear of abandonment in a way, not necessarily a full trust in Washington, but that fear of being left out is what's driving the U.S. Rising influence. So it's very interesting to see that when the people are asked if they had to choose between the U.S. and China, that majority would now align with the U.S. Up from the previous year's number. So and also that more than 50% respondents also want ASEAN to strengthen our own unity and resilience in order to avoid having to make the binary choice in the first place. So of course, again, this reflects the deeper truth that economic cooperation alone is not enough and cannot gloss over strategic anxiety. So at the same time, we also, that the fact that the region's trust is shifted more towards Japan and the EU, it tells us something that is quite crucial, which is that this region actually values not just strength, but also reliability, respect, and also consistency. That's my takeaway from the survey.
Thank you very much, Ibu Yenny. Now, may I just request that among the audience, if you want to ask any questions of the panelists, now is the time to put it into the Q&A function on your laptop. And we will shortly look at that. But I will keep on going for at least this one further question in the meantime. And for this one further question, I would really look again overall. I'm basically going to say that US engagement seems to be something that the region was confident of, and I think it's right that several of the panelists have already pointed out that this was as of that point in time when the survey was taken in January going slightly into February this year. They were confident that US engagement will increase as opposed to that which was the answer a year ago when they were looking back on the Biden administration and had been somewhat thinking less so about it. And I think if you look at the response to another question, similarly, respondents, more than half of them actually expected or expect going forward the region's relations with China to improve as well, although some disagree. So given that both US and China relations are the region are going to expected to be improving, what is it that we can take it that the countries could do or have done to make this, to have this perception that relationship will be increased? increasing? And what is your, I think there had earlier already been some responses from Mike regarding whether or not the Trump administration would take up the suggestions in this survey. But if you have any further comments on how the engagement between US and China with the region could improve or could change over the coming period, perhaps you can give your suggestions now. And I would like to reverse the order totally and give the floor back to Ibu Yenny to talk first. So from the region's point of view, you've seen the responses from the respondents. Of course, you had qualified that it is now supposed to be a little bit different given what has happened in the meantime. But yeah, what do you think the region would respond positively to, or have already responded positively to over the last year or so, to expect improvement in relations with both these superpowers? So Ibu Yenny, over to you first.
Yeah, I think the fact that more than half of the ASEAN respondents believe that relations with China will improve in the next few years, the next 3 years, it shows that there is still, that most of us in the regions think that there is still room for improvement, for constructive engagement with China. So, but of course, this is not, the optimism is not equal to full trust. I mean, we are hopeful about the future, but of course, the China's action will remain to be scrutinized in the region, even though China's roles in the region is expanding, but also the scrutiny is also still going to be there. And I think China, of all the nations in the region, also realizes that the issue of trust is very, very important. And once broken, I think it's hard to rebuild. So I think for China to foster stronger relations in the region, it must go beyond economic deals and infrastructure projects. It must address our legitimate concerns, with the maritime assertiveness and the other behavior that might be perceived as being overly aggressive in the region. So I think that would be my takeaways, that China needs to change the way it engages with the region, to go beyond economic deals, but through a more meaningful engagement and respecting of our positions. Over to you again, Director.
Peter, would you like to go next as far as this question is concerned?
Thank you. Well, look, I think the holy grail for the region still remains: how do you strike a strategic balance in a region where rivalry between China and the US is rife, which has larger elements of multipolarity than it did in the past, and which has a range of differing national interests. I think the dilemma for ASEAN is it wants a strategic balance, but it is not capable of being an active contributor to the construction of that strategic balance, in part because its non-aligned instincts doesn't lead it to that direction. And I take Yenny's point that things are changing there in terms of shifting away from a traditional non-aligned movement to a more interest-based one, but also in part because finding a consensus within ASEAN as to just what that contribution to the striking of strategic balance will be, I think is going to prove very difficult. So what that means is that that project will by and large be led and shaped by others, which, if you contrast it with the concept of ASEAN centrality, is a bit of a paradox, to put it mildly. I think it's important, given all the churn and uncertainty that's happening around us at the global level, that we don't completely shut the door on regional institutions, because there still remains a very important agenda for regional institutions. And while geopolitics at the moment may have put much of that in abeyance, we should be doing everything we can to keep as much of the regional institutional momentum going as we possibly can. And also to recognize that an inevitable feature of that is going to be the creation of more sub-regional groupings, whether it's so-called coalitions of the willing or other trilateral structures. We're already seeing this as a feature of the region, and I think it will only get stronger. And I would hope that ASEAN would not take the view that there is an essential tension between the development of sub-regional institutions and the role of ASEAN, because I think the two can be looked at from a complementary perspective rather than one excluding the other. And ultimately, I think, the focus on economic growth is going to be central to the way in which Southeast Asia navigates its future and positions itself in the broader region. And so that goes to ensuring that, notwithstanding the sort of political appeal of turning your back on open economies, that national policies on the economic front focus more sharply on what we know creates economic growth, versus managing the sort of politics of self-reliance or self-sufficiency, and this increasing temptation to rely more and more on indigenous production, because we've convinced ourselves that supply chains somehow add an unacceptable level of vulnerability. So that, together with the sort of bigger project of regional integration, I think is going to be very important to the forward economic agenda, which itself is going to be a crucial component of the way in which Southeast Asia navigates this more difficult environment. Thank you.
Mike, do you have any more comments on this particular issue? If you just brief ones, if any.
Yes. I think the survey shows that ASEAN respondents are relatively shows a positive attitude toward China and ASEAN relations in the next 3 years. In fact, China is also optimistic about the development of China-ASEAN relationship, because one of the advantages I think China has is its consistency in dealing with Southeast Asia. That our policy has always been there. That is to regard ASEAN as a priority in our neighborhood diplomacy. So with this solid foundation, I think China want to expand engagement and cooperation with ASEAN countries. Of course, there will be some problems, not only in security field, but also in the economic field. But I think that we can solve these problems if we stick to the spirit of cooperation and try to develop further cooperation in various fields. Besides, I think that China has always want ASEAN to play a bigger role in dealing with the volatile geopolitical strategic environment, because ASEAN has its agency and ASEAN can exert its agency. It is also in the interest of China with the solidification of the ASEAN-centered multilateral mechanisms. ASEAN, of course, is hedging between China and the United States. China will not force ASEAN to choose sides. What we are doing is just to enhance cooperation with ASEAN so as to further develop our bilateral relations and to contribute to the regional peace and development. Because in this area, I think both China and ASEAN countries still take economic development and the people's welfare as the main concern. So we have this, common, foundation for further enhancing this bilateral relationship. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to give the floor to Mike, and I think that I just want to also add one question that came in from Edwin Ong. He comes from Cao Bao, which is the Mandarin Chinese newspaper that circulates in Singapore and the region, and also in China, an online edition. And his question actually a little bit, shall we say, contrary to what Prof Liu Lin has just talked about, which is his postulation is that given that the US had overtaken China as the prevailing choice, I think this is just, of course, one question in the whole survey. Does that indicate that the Southeast Asian countries have become much more concerned about security and geopolitical issues than compared to the economic issues, which I think Prof Liu Lin had said that it was the stronghold of the, shall we say, the relations between the region and China. So, Mike, do you think that this has changed?
Probably. I do think the question points out something that we should recognize, which is international relations are not one-dimensional. Australia's relationship with ASEAN countries or America's or China's are not decided by one set of issues. You can have a relationship that's deeper and positive on trade, but getting worse on security. And you can have the opposite. You can have a relationship that's getting stronger on security, but weaker on trade. My expectation is going forward, we will see that the security perception of China within ASEAN will get worse because the PLA footprint, the exercises, the rules of engagement are becoming more aggressive, and there's no indication that's going to change. Peter's right. If you did the survey today, I suspect the views of Trump would be more negative. But if you do the survey in 6 months, maybe they wouldn't. I think Liberation Day, I'm in Washington. I was in Congress today talking to members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats. The backlash from the markets and from the public, which does not like inflation, is so negative that nobody is quite sure if this new round of tariffs is the floor and that President Trump wants to keep adding more tariffs, even though it costs him politically and economically, or if it's the ceiling. He's put this out, now he's going to try to negotiate deals with different countries and use it as leverage. So I don't think we can predict exactly what will happen with U.S. economic relations with ASEAN. I think Peter's right. In the near term, it's negative. My larger point would be we're in a world where you can have security relations get closer and economic relations get worse, or vice versa. I don't know, maybe you need to think about how to reflect that in the survey next time. and divide up the nature of bilateral relations a bit more. The other thing is, I suspect next year when you do the survey, you'll find there's more of a divergence among ASEAN member states. I think countries like the Philippines or Vietnam will be less. They'd like to have ASEAN centrality. They'd like to have multilateralism, but they can't afford to count on it. Whereas a country like Brunei or Malaysia, has relatively more room because they're not directly confronting PLA destroyers and Chinese Coast Guard ships. So I suspect when you do the survey next year, because of all these trends, you'll find there's more variation among ASEAN member states. That actually might make it harder to have ASEAN centrality. We'll see, but that's the kind of strange world we live in, where security and economic issues do not move at the same time at the same direction.
There are a couple of questions that are online that I would like to kind of bring it in because they are very much related to what we are discussing right now and related to the response that Mike has just given. They try to peer a little bit deeper into this same issue, but looking at the country level. So there is the question from Melody Chan, who I believe is from Channel News Asia, who refers to the tariffs and in particular asks how that the countries that actually responded very positively this time around, which includes Vietnam, how that these announcements might actually affect that. Grateful for anyone who would like to comment on that. And then similarly from Lin Kwok, who I think is from Brookings, she has asked the question to the same country, Vietnam, but also Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, because I think they are on the receiving end of the higher round of kind reciprocal tariffs. So perhaps anyone who would like to comment on either of these questions. Maybe Ibu Yenny could try to talk about the Indonesia response, or others can also talk about Vietnam and others. Yeah.
Yes, I think Indonesia is facing quite a hard road ahead. We are hit with quite one of the highest tariffs by President Trump. I think, if I'm not mistaken, 32% for Indonesia. That's what the tariff that is imposed on us. But fortunately, the import from the U.S. is not very high. It only accounts for, I think, 0.9% of our imports in total. But I think for us, this is, and not just looking at Indonesia's perspectives, but also the region's perspectives. This is actually a good time to put Asian centrality to this is the right momentum for that, in the sense that we can no longer rely on both superpowers. So we need to devise our own ways to strengthen the region. We need to go beyond just mere talks. All these issues with the code of conduct and all these delays, and we haven't really come up with anything substantial. We cannot afford no more delays. And also when it comes to the economic strengthening of the region, this is also a time to do that in a way, and move towards a real action. I don't know, maybe dependence on China on infrastructure projects can be overcome by maybe if the region comes up with our own sovereign wealth fund, for example, the Nusantara Fund, that would fund all these regional manufacturing capabilities or infrastructure projects that could be one way to still spur growth in the region without overly dependent upon to these two major superpowers. So, and I think many countries will have to come up with ways to deal with these newly imposed tariffs, because it will hurt us quite badly.
Is there anyone else who would like to respond? Yes, Peter, over to you.
Just very briefly, I'm not aware of any country that has welcomed the imposition of tariffs on them. So this is not the best way to win friends. But the main point I want to make is this imposition of tariffs is not just an issue in bilateral relationships. I mean, when we in Australia look at tariffs, the cost to us of tariffs on our export to the US market is not our major concern. It is a concern, and obviously we don't like it, but it is the flow-on effects for the entire global trading system, which I think would worry most countries more than, where they line up in the table of bilateral tariffs. So at a time when, frankly, we're facing a pretty uncertain global economic outlook, this runs a very high risk of making it much worse. And we've kind of been here before in the interwar period, when the imposition of tariffs has led to beggar thy neighbour policies, and we know that ended in tears, and I hope we're not heading in a similar direction.
Thank you for that. Would anybody like to respond or give a indication of what you think with regard to Vietnam? Because I think for Vietnam, there's also a question that I'd like to add on, that is from the participants from Ms Mi-Yong Kim. And she actually asked about Vietnam in the context of the South China Sea. She raises it that if you compare it bilaterally with what the approach taken by the Philippines, so both Philippines and Vietnam are, of course, very strong claimant states of parts of the South China Sea, and have taken different approaches, but which have, in a way, kind of elicited different responses from China. We all know that Vietnam actually is island building quite extensively in recent days and recent weeks. The response from China is not quite as vocal and aggressive as it is to the Philippines, which hasn't done that much island building. I think Professor Liu Lin mentioned earlier that there had been materials brought through Second Thomas Shoal by Philippine ships. Yes, but not quite to the same extent as what's happening in Vietnam parts. So perhaps what is it that works on the South China Sea from China's point of view, and also in general, what do you think, if you are able to give a view on Vietnam, how it is kind of could respond to the tariffs that are being imposed on it by the US? Of course, it is the third highest deficits or surplus with the US. So, Prof Liu, you would like to just talk a little bit about that?
Thank you. I want to make a response as to the China's attitude toward Vietnam and the Philippines in the South China Sea issue. I think one point is that I don't agree that we adopted different approaches to different claimants. In fact, China holds the same position that we should handle these issues through bilateral negotiations and cooperation. One of the differences, I think, is that I don't agree that the Philippines has not done much as Vietnam. In fact, the Philippines approach has changed a lot in the past several years. First is its enhanced cooperation, military cooperation with the United States, the bases and the default deployment, and more exercises, more maritime patrol actions, and things like that. Another difference is the Philippines is enhancing its maritime Coast Guard presence in the South China Sea. And the third is that the Philippines is trying to use the same tactics as the second Thomas Shoal to, in last year, it deployed a Coast Guard cutter in the Sabina Shoal for several months. So I think all these actions makes the China's have to deal with this. Of course, we are also concerned about the Vietnam's island reclamation because it's such a large scale. But I think China and the Vietnam is having negotiations and discussions on this issue, but not as the Philippines, which is hyping up the issue in the public media with the transparency initiative. So I think on the South China Sea issue, it's a problem that is between China and the ASEAN claimants. It's a interaction. So not just depend on China's attitude or China's actions. It also has something to do with the claimants, their own actions and their own approaches. So that's my opinion.
Thank you very much, Prof Liu. I think that we still have actually a lot of open questions in the Q&A forum, but I would not have the time to really address them on air. I think there are a lot of participants who are eagerly awaiting us to upload the report. The full report will go up after we have closed this webinar. So I think in order not to delay them too long, we will we'll basically conclude this webinar. There are many issues that I think we have not really had a chance to go deep into, but I think that leaves much opportunity for us to take these up in future. But let me really thank our panel of very esteemed and distinguished panelists for joining us to be on the spot to answer questions and also to make their responses to what the participants have thrown at all of us. So thank you very much, and I hand it back to Indira to close this webinar.
Thank you, Mr. Choi, Ms. Sia, and our esteemed panelists, Dr. Michael Green, Professor Liu Lin, Mr. Peter Varghese, and Ms. Yenny Wahid for your valuable insights in helping us understand what the results say about Southeast Asia's outlook on the region and international developments. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of the program for the e-launch and discussion of the State of Southeast Asia 2025 Survey Report. The digital copy of the survey is available for download on the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute's website, or it can also be accessed by clicking on the link in the webinar chat. Thank you for joining us today, and we wish you a pleasant day ahead.